Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right, welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast with our co-hosts Nathan Pfluger and Dr. Andrew Little, myself. Today we had the fortunate opportunity to speak with Buddy Huffaker, the director of the Aldo Leopold Foundation. So Buddy, thanks again for joining in today. How about you give a little introduction, a little background about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Nathan, great to be here with you and love your program, Wild Ag, and excited to bring the Leopold message to it. My name's Buddy Huffaker. I'm the executive director of the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And in case any of your listeners aren't aware of who Aldo Leopold was, he's often referred to as the father of modern conservation movement. He was a professionally trained forester, basically the founder of wildlife management movement through his first book called Game Management. He was a restoration ecologist, a philosopher, and writer. And that's how most people come to know Aldo Leopold, is through his writing, and in particular, his book, A Sand County Almanac. And we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of that book, which has now been translated into 15 different languages. And so it really serves as one of the world's kind of grounding pieces of literature for anybody who cares about the land and the environment.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really exciting. And actually, I brought a few of those books along, like you mentioned, Game Management. I got
Love it.
Yeah. And then actually, when I was there last July, I got a nice edition here, a new one of the Sand County Almanac. I had one from older version that had, I think, a lot of tears in the pages of it, because I had read through it a number of times. So it's been more, like you said, one of those definite staples for the wildlife community.
Yeah, and
so,
I always love seeing people's copies that are all dog-eared and chewed up. But
Yeah.
it never hurts to get another one. And a quick plug, we actually have them on sale for $7.50 in honor of the 75th anniversary. So you can check out the Leopold Foundation website and either get a new copy like you, or get your first copy if somebody out there hasn't read it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. Yeah, and I've been reading other books. One of the other ones for the health of the land. That's one that I've really enjoyed. Again, all of them are very good, but it's one of the ones I've been enjoying a lot, especially given my focus here in Nebraska with conservation and ag landscapes, and kind of reading through. And one of the things that stood out to me in that was that a lot of the things that he dealt with back during his years are very similar challenges that we face today, and kind of finding some of those balances for conservation in our landscapes. And it's not always the easiest. There's a lot of different players, and we'll probably dive into that in a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, when I was rereading the land ethic portion of the Sand County Almanac, it surprised me how many things that Aldo brought up that are pertinent today and that seem to be quote unquote new today. And they were thinking about them 75, 80 years ago. It just blew my mind. And I thought it was kind of unfortunate that it's just coming to a headway now. But we always say that conservation's slow. So.
Yeah, well, you two have it right. I mean, he was ahead of his time. In some ways, we're still catching up, but you keep trying. And he actually articulated that this was going to be a slow, laborious process to get everybody to understand the importance of taking care of the land, to take care of ourselves. So he, in some ways, he wouldn't be surprised that we're still at it and facing some of the same challenges.
Yeah, that slow, laborious process. Actually, that quote, I use that in a lot of my presentations to talk about how conservation just takes time. And I said, usually the analogy I always say is I pick up my phone and say, ultimately, we want things instantaneous. That's just human nature, but that's not how it works, especially in the conservation realm. It takes time. And unfortunately, I'm probably one of the most impatient people out there, and you want stuff to happen immediately, and it doesn't. Like, it just takes time, and there's a lot of, it's kind of that new unfolding of the land and kind of the relationship with the land. So I think it's such an important thing, and which again is part of why we wanted to bring you on, just because of this 75th anniversary and what the Aldo Leopold Foundation does. And so I guess maybe could you speak a little bit to the mission and vision of the Aldo Leopold Foundation and what you guys do for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so the Leopold Foundation was established by the 5 children of Aldo and Estella Leopold, all who would end up being really influential scientists and conservationists in their own right. And we're located in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is a little town about an hour north of Madison, Wisconsin, where the University of Wisconsin is, and where Aldo Leopold was a professor. And we're located here because we're basically on the banks of the Wisconsin River, and it's where the family purchased a worn-out farm, a sand farm. We're in the glacial outwash valley of Glacial Lake, Wisconsin, so extremely sandy, infertile soil. They bought a farm there where the previous owner was just not able to make a go of it as an active agricultural producer. And they began planting pine trees and prairie and doing wildlife projects. And it was really for Aldo Leopold, who had previously worked for the Forest Service in the public sector and become a professor. It was his chance, as I like to say it, to practice what he preached. He was teaching, mainly at that time, farmers who were coming to the college to get a kind of broader education and technical education to go back and run their family farm operations. And he was asking them to think about why and how they might have spots on their farms that would support wildlife. And so, but he had never had to do that himself, really, on his own land, with his own budget, with his own labor force.
Sure, yeah.
And so this was his chance for he and his family to experiment with those things and reap some successes and some failures. And it was kind of in that experience, working as a family, again, kind of realizing the challenges that private landowners have in implementing and caring for their land, that he came up with this idea of writing a book for a popular audience. Because again, he was a professor, he was teaching classes and engaging audiences that way. But he began to realize that this kind of conservation movement was going to take everybody. And so that inspired him to start writing the essays that ultimately would comprise the Sand County Almanac. And so when the family created the foundation, they entrusted it with the farm. So we continue to care for it. It's now a National Historic Landmark. And then they also granted us the rights to his published and unpublished writings. So we serve as the executor of Leopold's literary estate. And so it's kind of fun. We're a little bit unique from a conservation organization perspective in that we do active land management, wildlife management, still trying to figure out how to diversify that landscape. But then we also kind of think very broadly, philosophically, conceptually about how do we start to reframe our relationship between with each other and with the natural world. And so that's kind of really our mission, is to have the land ethic remain relevant and be connected to the conservation movement, and challenge us to kind of pivot from an economic-centric worldview to an ecological worldview.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that you brought up, that Aldo took the chance to actually do it for himself. Because I think in today's conservation realm, a lot of conservation personnel don't have that experience of doing it on their land. So it's hard to meet that landowner on their property and say, hey, you should do this, this, and this, and really not know what it all entails. So that's neat that he took that step.
Well, and Nathan, also just think about how the world has changed. That was true for Leopold, but when Leopold was writing, 30% of our country still lived in the rural landscape. Now, so that means 70%, 70% still lived in the rural landscape. 30% were in urban communities. That ratio is reversed now. And so we have more and more people who care about the environment, but are disconnected to it kind of geographically, physically in that way, and haven't had those responsibilities to reap the rewards and challenges of planting their own field, taking care of the trees that they plant, monitoring the wildlife that's there. So I think in some ways that's also why his book is still so prescient, is that for people who care about these things, it really challenges them to think about how we need to build this public-private partnership across the landscape.
Sure.
So you mentioned that the foundation actively works to diversify the landscape, put conservation out there. A couple questions. Are you still actively doing that on the old farm? And then how do you work with landowners to accomplish that on their property or on the landscape?
Yeah, so we do that in two ways. So yeah, the Leopold Foundation now owns about 500 acres. So that's bigger than the original footprint that the family purchased. We do have what we call the cultural resource zone. So that's the original 35 acres that the family purchased. That's where a lot of the pine trees are that they planted and the first prairie that they planted. And so I always say, people come here from all over the world to see what the Leopold family did, not what Buddy Huffaker thinks Aldo Leopold would do if he were alive today. So,
Sure.
so in some ways, like there's too many pines, we're still thinning them and trying to, we will have at some point a kind of old growth pine forest, but that's not a particularly appropriate habitat type for this part of Wisconsin. But they didn't, at that point, pines were thought to be great wildlife habitat, and they are in a diverse forest, not in a kind of monoculture, but they were also cheap. And so the family got access to them to plant them at a time when other planting material was expensive or rare. And they grow fast in poor soils. And so their first goal was just stabilize the soil. So at any rate, there are some spots that we manage more for the cultural values than for the ecological values. But then radiating out from that, we are managing for a grass-based ecosystem. So prairie, savanna, we're using fire and commercial forestry to convert stands from closed forest to open canopy. We're doing some rotational grazing with a private landowner adjacent to us. So we work with a couple of families that are adjacent to the Leopold farm, and that's now about 4,500 acres that we're, again, kind of managing for grass and savanna. And then beyond that, we work with landowners across the state of Wisconsin through a program called My Wisconsin Woods. And that's helping landowners understand what they have on their property and how to develop a basic management plan, and then access different programs that are available through the state of Wisconsin and through the USDA to kind of gain access to technical assistance or financial assistance to improve the management of their properties. And so we've been working about 20,000 landowners across the state of Wisconsin now, totaling over 1 million acres of landowners that previously, and we've been really targeting landowners that were not already enrolled in state and federal programs. All right. So we're trying to find the new landowners out there that have their land for a reason. They might have owned it for decades or maybe just bought it, but have not stepped into the role of trying to really meet their own management objectives. So basically trying to share what we've learned, and again, the mistakes we continue to make in some ways, taking care of our own land with others across the state of Wisconsin. And then beyond that, we partner with folks like you that are helping to challenge and inform and inspire landowners all across the country to step into their own land ethic.
Sure. Yeah.
I may have missed it, but when was the foundation actually established? I knew you said it was by his 5 children, but I didn't catch what year.
1982. And that was really in response to just a continued growing interest in their father's legacy and people showing up at the shack wanting to see it. And so that was kind of when they recognized, and in their own kind of family and estate planning, the 5 children were still alive, and they had to kind of figure out what was going to happen with some of these things. And so they created it in 1982.
That's really cool. Yeah, I actually had the fortunate opportunity to come up there and visit last July, and I really enjoyed just just learn a lot about the history. So definitely for those out there, if you haven't had a chance to go visit, definitely go get that chance to visit. It's such a cool place, and going out there to just walk around the property and just kind of thinking about what he saw at that time. And I think you hit the nail on the head there earlier too, with the point of him just getting that connection to and being able to then relate, and you can obviously tell that through his writings that those connections were very, very personal to him, and they were very important in kind of his decision making and kind of thinking through, and then in turn sharing that information out to others. So yeah.
And Andy, you actually just summarized the structure of a Sand County Almanac, knowingly or unknowingly. But he's really trying to take the reader on a journey with him. It's kind of like going on a walk with your grandfather in the woods. And the first section of the book is all just about identifying and learning what's happening on the farm. And then the second stage gets into kind of like ag conservation policy. Okay, here are the issues at play. Here are things we should be thinking about and deploying conservation investments. And then the final section is really about, okay, I'm working on these matters. I care about them. How are we going to reframe our relationships to really move towards a ecological land ethic? And so but it starts with kind of knowing where you're at and what's all around you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah. So with being at the 75th anniversary of the Sand County Almanac, it sounded like you were really wanting to bring that land ethic idea to the top, if I understood you correctly. So, and I know it's going to vary across the U.S. I mean, here in Nebraska, eastern portion of the state, we're heavily dominated by row crop agriculture. When you move west, we have the sand hills. So the land ethic is going to look different in different states and even different parts of the state. What do you think Aldo's message would be today about the land ethic?
Well, I would go back to his own writing, but you make a great point, Nathan. I mean, the land ethic has to be in response to local realities and regional realities, right? And so he even writes at the end of a Sand County Almanac that he has presented the land ethic as a product of social evolution because nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It grows in the minds of a thinking community. So what was he asking for? Is podcasts just like this that engage people in thought and conversation. But the most important line, I believe, comes right out of the foreword of a Sand County Almanac when he writes, "When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And so it's that framing. It's when we see the world through that lens, right? Like that we are a part of it, not apart from it, that then we will start to align our actions based on those regional realities to ensure that the land is healthy and that people are healthy. So Nathan, I think, I think you're exactly right, as it's going to respond to what's happening where you are. And again, it's that sequence. You got to understand where you're at and what's happening to get engaged, to help find those solutions. And meanwhile, not lose the forest for the trees, right? Always be thinking about, are we valuing things the right way? Because if we get that right, everything that flows from it will be right.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Yeah, actually, working on my promotion tenure packet here, and that's actually a quote that I put in there that you just noted about with the community and kind of in thinking about we're as humans are a part of that system. And I think that's such an important thing because, and we'll probably dive into this in a little bit, but, obviously a lot of things, especially in ag landscape, and I would argue it can be even in a, forested landscape as well, is that, economics are a big driver of that decision making. And so kind of getting maybe a little away from that and kind of thinking about that ecological side, as you were noting, I think is so important.
Well, Andy, sign me up to be an endorser for your tenure package because you clearly got it right. But what? One thing I want to add, because at times folks in the conservation movement get a little get charged with being a little utopian and disconnected from reality. So I think it's really important to remember that if we shifted to an ecological worldview rather than an economic centric worldview, it doesn't mean economics fall away, right? It means just the economics follow our values and the priorities. And so I think that's so important for folks to remember, especially today when so many people don't grow up on the farm or in a rural setting, that farmers and producers are trapped in the same economic context that all of us are, where it's challenging at times as a consumer or customer to spend that extra money for organic milk or buy that grass-fed beef, though I know I want to. That's where my value set is, and that's true for farmers and producers these days as well. Sometimes some of the things they would like to do to take care of their land, we just have created perverse economic disincentives for them to do that. And Nathan, when before we got started, your program on enhancing cover and expanding cover crops across your region, like that's a great example. A farmer or producer may love and want to do that, but how do we bridge that gap of lost revenue to create that opportunity for them to do the right thing?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's always been our goal, is just finding how we can work with row crop producers, understanding that it needs to work for not only their operation, but at the end of the day, their bottom line. Because they want to keep that land and they feel they have a strong tie to it, even though they're having to use it for economic gain.
Right.
Again, Aldo talks about separating the economics from the land ethic. Today, we see a lot of maybe payments for carbon credits or biodiversity credits, and it seems like we're moving towards economics to help with that land ethic or help with conservation. What does the foundation make of those types of payments?
Yeah, I think we're all for them. I see this in many ways. Again, the caveat is those aren't necessarily the solution, right? Those are the triage, the mitigating efforts to buy us time and capacity to begin to shift our worldview. And so we have to find tools that reward private landowners and other investments into carbon sequestration, biochar, cover crops, all those things that, again, may not quite work in the current just market economy, left without any other subsidy or public investment, to learn what works, to pilot and test new things, to create new values and show what is good for the land and the human community as a result of investing in some of these new techniques and technologies. So we are supportive of them. Just we also need to add the and element to it. Well, we can't just do this. We can't kind of buy our way out of climate change is what I would say, right? Is that we need to mitigate and triage the things that are creating the havoc. But then we have to, again, if we get the lens right about what we care about and value, the economics and the processes will flow from that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Yeah, and I think that, just talking about it earlier and just the connection. And one of the things I talk to landowners, you mentioned about like the incentives. I've had some people say, well, hey, I'm very conservation minded, but policies out there are not maybe allowing me as much flexibility in what I'd like to do. And, taxes in the land, and then there's other things that go into that decision making. So what I always like to tell people is it's when you're meeting with producers, it's complex. The decision-making process is so complex, all the decisions that they have to make. And so even if they're not maybe making those decisions to say, hey, I want to put conservation out here, it could be because there's other things they're having to factor into that decision. And ultimately, they obviously, want to make money on the land and want to be sustainable in the long term. And so how can we figure out, like you said, innovative tools and techniques to be able to make it more, beneficial for them to say, hey, yeah, that makes sense. I can do that. I'm not going to have a major loss in income because I do X, Y, or Z. So
yeah, Andy, again, such a great point, and we forget out of genuine interest and intent, but we don't ask a banker or an attorney to just change careers and kind of go into a whole new field and not think about the economic implications of that individual and their family. And so, again, those that don't understand the complications, the realities of modern day agriculture, it's pretty easy to kind of critique or get frustrated when farmers aren't adopting new techniques or technologies as fast as we would like. But there's a lot that goes into that. And it's in having the conversation, ensuring that they're aware of opportunities available to them, and what the benefits are, multiple benefits are, that's the space where we make progress. And I love Leopold had this quote. I think it comes out of Farmer as a Conservationist, an essay he wrote in 1939, where he said, conservation ultimately will boil down to the public's investment in private land. And so it was this recognition, right, that we have to kind of get over these kind of ownership boundaries, and that we all have an interest in supporting private landowners that implement conservation practices. That can't just be borne by the farmer, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Without a doubt. And I would argue that today we're starting to see more social approval of conservation on private lands, and people are wanting to know where their food comes, and they want to know it was sustainably produced. So I would say that approval is growing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, you see kind of a growing interest, again, maybe not the full answer, but in certified food of, from whatever genre, in terms of how it's growing. You're seeing interest in where food comes from, with the kind of surgence of CSAs and smaller farms. Because in Wisconsin, we have this interesting dynamic where the average size of farms, or the average number of farms, is growing, but the average size of farms is shrinking. So in other words, we're getting more new small farms, while some of the bigger farms are obviously getting converted to either development or other land uses. So, but I think it is driving a new conversation and new interest in conservation coming from the dining room table.
Yeah, no, that's really good.
So we talked about the land ethic being an evolution, so it takes time. Does the foundation, have they identified any roadblocks or modern day obstacles to the evolution of a land ethic?
That's a great question. I think, the irony is we're seeing kind of movements happen in different ways, in that just population growth overall is happening at a rate that, kind of by extension, environmental harm is occurring, or overconsumption is occurring, while at the same time we're seeing, at least in the United States, a very environmentally, ecologically literate community. People are learning more about how the earth works and functions than ever before. I mean, my kids, when they were in middle school, knew more about ecology than I did at this point, and more interest in these things. It's just we're not really tying together that growing interest with the kind of opportunities and outcomes that would kind of mitigate the overall kind of population growth. So interesting things are happening with demographics. It'll be kind of a little harder to anticipate now that things like population growth, at least in the United States, is moving in a different direction than it was historically. And so in terms of barriers, I think, again, we're not asking the right questions. We're not making the right public investments across the landscape. So connecting conservation up from city centers to, working lands to remote wilderness areas. Everybody kind of has their own slice of the pie that they're interested and care about, but it's really, the strength's really going to come when we stitch all those interests together.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I like that aspect, and I've always thought about it like it's, you think about a pie, and you have all these different components that are going into it. So from a producer, it's, you have the people that they're working with within the ag industry, and then you have like your companies, like Kellogg, General Mills, that are obviously a component of that decision-making process. But then you have the general public, the researchers. You have all these different intricate pieces that go into it and make this complex puzzle. But the point I always come back to is you really got to get a lot of these players, if you want to say, at the table and have honest conversations around some of these challenges, and then develop innovative approaches moving forward. Unfortunately, that can be challenging. And it can be very complex. But the point being is that's where I think you're going to start seeing, as like you just said, stitching all those components together, where you're going to really start seeing bigger movements in my mind for conservation in our landscape. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that Aldo had an advantage over is he was very diverse in his studies. I mean, unlike today, we get in our lanes and, we focus on one thing. Maybe it's ag production or conservation or whatever it is, business. It's important to learn about all these different areas so then you can kind of put yourselves in their shoes and look at it from a different lens, because everybody's not looking at the problem the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Nathan, that is so true. If anybody's interested in that essay, Farmer as a Conservationist, you can find it in a book called The River of the Mother of God and Other Essays by Aldo Leopold. And it presents his writing arranged chronologically. So when he was a teenager to the last piece that he wrote before his death. But what it really does is show the breadth and depth of his thinking. He was interested in forestry. He was interested in agriculture. He was interested in wildlife. And he was interested in urban areas and rural areas. And so it's a great kind of primer on how we all need to be thinking across the landscape, more critically, more deeply, and connecting those dots. And, I think that's the other role and function of the Leopold Foundation, is because Leopold kind of creates this big tent, is to bring all those interests together and create and try to help catalyze that conversation that assesses, past, present, and future conservation, where we come from, where we at, and where we still need to be headed.
Sure.
So that sounds like education is a huge portion of that, especially for the foundation.
Yeah, correct. And we're trying to step into that even more. A lot of that these days is done electronically, but we have, I believe, a really tremendous e-newsletter that we put out twice a month that, again, explores different topics, not just the past, but what's happening currently, thought pieces about where we're headed, some fun elements in there. And then, with that kind of frequency, we get to cover different topics and different issues. So that's one of the ways that we're doing that. And then we're also looking to build a kind of stronger presence at the higher education, at the college level, because we know from basically anecdotal evidence, most people get introduced to Aldo Leopold on a college campus in some kind of environmental class of some kind. So creating some curriculum that helps really kind of challenge students to think about all these connections, to have a broad sense of conservation and connect some of those dots and empower them to be our ambassadors and advocates for this ecological worldview. So maybe following up with you two on that and how to do that at the University of Nebraska, but
that would be awesome.
Just getting started on that effort.
No, that's awesome. Well, and I actually think about, so we have a course that we designed about 3 years ago. It was Introduction to Production Ag Systems. And the point of the course is there's a lot of students that come here to campus that have no background, like you said, a connection to a farm or ranch. And so it was an opportunity to kind of give them kind of this basically 2-day introduction to production ag systems. And one of the things that we talk a lot about, and with our students here in the School of Natural Resources, is how do we best train them to go out and work in a production ag landscape? And that was a course that's been put together, amongst other things, being able to find ways to get them experience to go out and interact with those producers, because obviously they don't have a connection to a farm or ranch, and then they get a job as a biologist, say for Pheasants Forever or what other organization, and they don't have any of that background. That can create additional challenges in communicating, opportunities and ways that, again, just kind of building trust of that landowner is really what it comes down to. So, yeah,
well, but that sounds like a great class. Kudos to you for putting that together. And, where you ended is a term I've heard lately, so I can't attribute it to whoever deserves credit for it. But change happens at the speed of trust. And we forget about, like you said, we want everything to happen so fast. And yet we have to remember we have as much to learn about how to communicate and engage in these things as whatever community we're engaging. those kinds of classes and opportunities that open people's eyes to aspects of our world that they haven't had exposure to are just essential in this whole process.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and a little more on the trust aspect there. I would say that there's nobody a landowner trusts more than a neighboring landowner or
Right.
somebody else in his shoes. So to that point, do you guys do any hands-on education across this 4,500 acres, trying to bring new producers in and really getting their hands dirty, showing them what it is? Because I think that goes a long way. Education in the classroom is really important, but I don't think the advantages of hands-on education in the field could be understated.
Yeah, Nathan, we used to do a lot of that, recognizing exactly what you're saying, and so we were trying to do that. What we began to realize is, we're one organization in this one spot in the state or in the world, and we could only bring so many people together. So what we've tried to do with like My Wisconsin Woods is connect up with all these demonstration sites and make sure people are aware of them. Because, again, one of the things that was happening is with these field days is that often you get about 85% recidivism, right? It's the same people that show up. And so what we've been trying to dedicate ourselves to is finding where these demonstration sites or opportunities are and help improve the marketing and communication to get new landowners there so that they can learn and have that peer-to-peer learning environment and opportunity. So we recognize the value and just kind of realized that our better role was in helping to amplify what was happening elsewhere than trying to do it all ourselves.
Sure. I think when I was up there in July, that was one of the things that hit me, and talking with Steve, and we had this discussion about, how do we best, so like he explained how the Aldo Leopold Foundation kind of operated with these other organizations and kind of help do some of this facilitation. And it really hit me, and he sent me a little kind of newsletter he had put together, a document he put together a while back, and kind of showing the different steps in that adoption process. And to me, it really hit me and kind of saying, like you said, we can't do everything. We have to have partners as a part of that. But back to that kind of peer-to-peer learning, that to me is so instrumental. And I actually have a Zoom call coming up on Monday where I'm meeting with some colleagues over in the UK who have been doing more of these peer-to-peer learnings opportunities with producers over there. And it's worked really well because ultimately, the producers can share their opinions on like, hey, this worked, this didn't work. Here you can come literally visit my farm or ranch and talk through these challenges. And the other thing is back to trust. They usually know a lot of those peers within that area. So they maybe go to church with them. They have, kids are in basketball or whatever, some sporting event. So they've already built that trust over the years. And now they're just continuing that. And then it's continuing to expand out. It's not obviously a perfect ripple in the pond effect, but it's definitely when you start building those cooperatives on the landscape, that's where I think and then starting to talk about the land ethic of a part of that, then they are kind of working as a community themselves to start expanding that, conservation of the landscape. So
absolutely. And then I think again, the other thing that kind of conservation organizations or entities, another important role for us to play that is implied in what both of you are saying is that we are recognizing that kind of leadership and promoting it by, helping them. They host a field day on their farm. And then the context, the kind of, Nathan, you talked about that social approval. Here are these outside entities saying, this is really important. This is really exciting. What's being tried here. And it's kind of an extended thank you to those that show up, interested in learning, maybe skeptical at first, but, at least willing to show up and learn about it. I think that's the other part that we sometimes forget is that we are that social approval mechanism and landowners rarely get thanked for the good work that they do, right? I mean, and it doesn't replace the income that they need to keep the operation solvent, but who doesn't like to be thanked for doing good work? And that sometimes we just take for granted that that's going to happen. And boy, that goes a long ways in adding those extra elements and context for why landowners should adopt new practices.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, without a doubt. One of the things that I really latched onto in Aldo's writings was he always talks about not relearning something that we already covered in the past or we've seen happen before. And I mean, I think the most obvious one would be erosion that's happening. And one of the quotes that just sticks out to me, or part of the quote, is the conquer role is eventually self-defeating. And I mean, that's overarching. Hey, let's learn from these previous mistakes. Are you taking any steps to kind of teach that as well at the foundation?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question, Nathan. I mean, I think what, is part of a lot of our education is the social, economic, ecological context under which Leopold's vision of a land ethic emerged. And so things like the Dust Bowl, right? I mean, we often sometimes think, well, climate change, we're the first generation to face any real ecological challenges. Well, that's not true. I mean, we've had a lot of the deforestation of the eastern United States, the Dust Bowl. So to your point, learning that, hey, we have had these environmental challenges in the past, but they took real effort and investment to mitigate and overcome. Like the Dust Bowl didn't just end on its own. We started changing agricultural practices. We started, planting grass and CRP and row crop rotations and no-till. So all those innovations came out of those challenges, and I think that is part of our context. Is like, let's understand the history whereby we got to this point. To your point, and then so what do we do moving forward now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's really, in my opinion, how this podcast got started is we want to be able to have the conversation with landowners, conservation organizations, others to be able to take and not only talk about some of the challenges in the past, what's going on now, but really thinking to the future. Going to be very forward thinking. What other innovative approaches, like you were just describing, do we need to think about and helping kind of, build conservation out into the future and thinking about the sustainability of our systems? Because as you pointed out, Nathan, originally, producers want to ensure the sustainability of their property. That's, a fact. And so how do we help them, but knowing that they have all these complex decisions that they're trying to make on that property every single year? And I think one of the things that hit me, this was a while back, but somebody had said, think about getting, you get paid maybe every 2 weeks or a month or whatever. Think about getting paid, a couple times a year when your money's coming in from the grain you're selling. Like people don't fully understand, like, oh, well, you're not getting a monthly paycheck per se. No, you in cases are getting at the end of the year when you're harvesting those crops. And so it's one of those, they have to, again, that budgeting is so critical as they're working through for their farm operation. And so that's that complexity that I think sometimes you don't fully recognize, if you're not necessarily living on a farm or ranch. So,
well, and again, things you pointed out there that are important for all of us to remember. We all get a bit myopic at times too, right? About what is the job at hand and what am I getting paid to do and what am I, responsible for at the end of this day? And so again, it takes this community. It takes that's why the extension community is so important. It helps landowners kind of, pop their head up and be aware of what else is out there, what else we need to be thinking about, because we didn't solve the Dust Bowl without innovation and change. And so that's the kind of reminder that we have to help people understand, is that to be solvent and successful in the future, we do have to adapt and change. And that's always been true.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I would say, just speaking for the future personally, I'm really excited in the direction that we're heading, because I feel like we're just getting really close to a tipping point. The younger generation is coming back to the farm. They want to see changes. So I think it's a really exciting time. And to that, are there any unpublished writings of Aldo Leopold that are still to come?
Ooh, that's a good question. Probably his best work is available in some kind of book format at this point. The River of the Mother of God is, again, an indispensable book for the health of the land. Is all of his communication and writings for what was then called the Wisconsin Agriculturalist and Farmer, so is very kind of farm specific. And then there's been a new book called that was issued by what's called Library of America, and it's a Sand County Almanac and other writings on ecology and conservation. It also includes a lot of correspondence he had with other professionals and colleagues at that time period. So it's really rich in bringing out kind of that personal dimension of Leopold and who he is communicating with and how his communication style and those kind of interpersonal settings. So that's a lot of material is now available. But if you want to find more, Nathan, we have digitized all of his archival materials. It's all available at the University of Wisconsin Archives. And it really is fascinating. If you have a particular interest, you can get in there and kind of drill down and find some gems. But in terms of actual publishing in this day and age, and given the realities of kind of publishing, I think he's been high graded, so to speak, to use that term.
That's good. That's good. One other question I wanted to ask you about is, so with the community education, so I am an extension specialist, and I'm trying to think about, as reading through the various books that Aldo's wrote, thinking about, again, today, how, and kind of moving forward, if he was here today and kind of his suggestions, what other things do you think beyond what we've already discussed would he, kind of recommend or suggest we, to kind of continue to expand conservation and continue to work with people to instill that land ethic? Really from an extension side, you mentioned that with kind of innovative, tools and things like that, but is there anything else that you think of and kind of knowing him and kind of the, from all his writings and stuff, that you would want to add?
Well, boy, again, I think it'd be at these three levels, to come back to those that, no action is too small. And so to do what you can where you're at, for him, that's planting trees and planting prairie. For a producer, it might be cover cropping or enrolling, that unproductive field in CRP. There'd be that next level of kind of diagnosing and advocating for conservation investment. Right now, getting involved with the Farm Bill and ensuring that critical piece of legislation is renewed and retains the kind of conservation investments on every aspect of our landscape is absolutely critical. And then finding those times and moments to be reflective and to, again, try to reshape and reframe the conversation about what's important and how do we recast our relationship with each other in the natural world. So for him, that was journaling and writing. For others, it might be hosting a podcast.
Sure.
But I think if to the extent all of us could be thinking and working at each three of those levels to the extent and where and when we can, that's, again, as we were talking earlier, going to vary if you're a farmer in eastern Nebraska to an attorney in downtown Chicago, but we all have opportunities to engage in this bigger effort and movement, and finding it and doing it is the real important part.
That's really good. Yeah, and I like the first point there about like no effort is too small, because I think that sometimes you feel like you got to do a lot. You got to feel like you got to make these big, huge strides. Oh, I got to take and go out and take this 150-acre field and put it into a conservation program. It's like, well, no, that's not what people are asking. It's more of, hey, maybe take that 5 acres. It's not very productive over here, and take that out. And so it's, again, I think it's those little small things that sometimes we kind of think, oh, that's not going to matter. But really, when you start looking at it, one of the things I do with a lot of our research, we have kind of a landscape level look at things, and we look at how all these little patches potentially play a bigger role. But if you didn't have all those little patches out there, then yeah, it has some negative impacts in the landscape. And so ultimately, those little things can really add up fairly quickly to have a large level impact. So.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with somebody who was bemoaning a phrase that I don't hear as often anymore, but it was the phrase of random acts of conservation, as if these little things here and there happen by happenstance and then thus don't have a lot of value. And his argument was, well, they happened there for a reason, because somebody was there and that's what they could make happen. And to your point, when all stitched together, they do make a difference and they do have an impact. And so, yeah, I think, again, getting started is the most important thing, and then keeping it going.
Yep, that's a good point.
And I would argue if somebody needs something to get started with, reading the Sand County Almanac would be a really good starting point.
That would be, yeah.
All right,
so
Nathan, I'm advocating for your tenure as well now.
I appreciate it. Do you guys have anything else big planned for the 75th anniversary of the Sand County Almanac, or what does the rest of the year look like for that?
Yeah, well, actually, we have monthly virtual programs speaking on different conservation-related themes. On a whole range of topics. We're also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the designation of the Gila Wilderness Area in New Mexico as the world's first recognized wilderness area, which Leopold was the visionary and architect of. So up to now, a lot of the programs have focused kind of on the wilderness theme, but we just helped celebrate the centennial out in Silver City, New Mexico. So the remainder of the year starts to focus a little bit more on the land ethic. We have, like, one of our guests in October is the Wild Idea Buffalo Ranch, if you're familiar with them, up in South Dakota. And so, I think, folks could tune in to those virtual programs again and become part of that conversation.
And for somebody looking to tune in or learn more about the foundation or just what you guys are doing in general, where should they look?
Website's a great spot, just www.aldoleopold.org. And we have links to all those resources. We have a learning hub about the land ethics. So if you want to read more or some exercise or little vignettes, you can go there. We're looking, again, maybe another potential collaboration with you all in the future to build out some case studies that we could have that would show what does a land ethic look like in eastern Nebraska versus southern Florida versus northern California. So that's another effort that we're just kind of launching and kind of plan to have kind of some releases in next year, 2025. This year, we're really just kind of using it as a PR year and some time to put some of those building blocks in place for the 75th anniversary. And then some of these pieces will follow up on the heels of that.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, and I just, like I said, being there, getting the opportunity, I always tell people, go there, check it out. I thought it was such a cool experience, and going to the shack and getting to learn a little more about Aldo Leopold outside of his writings. So,
yeah, it's definitely on my bucket list, without a doubt. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience, Buddy, before we wrap things up?
No, appreciate the opportunity to share some of the resources that we have and how people can find them, and really appreciate the conversation and the energy that you two bring and the work that each of you are doing. I often say the Leopold Foundation has this great honor that everybody working in conservation is basically advancing our mission. And so it's just fun to extend our thanks for everybody who's out there doing whatever they can and extending the Leopold legacy in that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on and joining us. And definitely have to have you back in the future. So,
yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks again. Thanks for your work.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.